Good evening, everyone. I hope that you can all hear me. Thank you so much for joining us today for this very important conversation. I will ask all of the speakers that are joining us today to please send us a request or just check your notifications for the request that we sent you to take the mic. Once all of my speakers are on the panel, I will just start the conversation. In the meantime, please do share this space in your different platforms, but also inviting you to follow us on Twitter because we do have a good number of these conversations that happen across the different months, so you don't want to miss that. For the speakers, please send us a request so that we give you the mic. Okay, so I'm still getting all of my speakers and the panel to just be on the mic. Samuel, if you can hear me, please just send us a request to take the mic. Same with you, Blessing and Daniel. I can see all of you. I can see your names, but I can't see your request. So please just send me a request. But while I'm waiting for all of you to get on the conversation, I'll just jump in to just give us context to why we're having this conversation today. I think one of the things I want to mention early on is that the Resistance Bureau is a platform that commits itself to convening critical conversations on human rights and democratic governance. Africa is our departure point, but we do also reflect more broadly on global issues, global processes that impact on human rights, democratic governance in different parts of the world. So today we're meeting at a very important moment that many have described as a constitutional crossroads for Zimbabwe. So the Constitution of Zimbabwe Amendment number 3 bill has been approved by Cabinet, and it proposes far-reaching structural changes that include the extension of the electoral cycle from 5 years to 7 years. By that extension, lengthening the terms of members of parliament and the president. And should those kind of changes be effected, it actually would apply to the incumbent as well, who's the president, Emerson Mnangagwa. There are also other proposals around the replacement of the direct presidential election by popular vote with an indirect system in which the president is elected by parliament, the expansion of the Senate by additional seats that are appointed by the president, the removal of constitutional restrictions on the political conduct of traditional leaders, elimination of public interviews in the judicial appointment processes, the issues of the dissolution of the Zimbabwe Gender Commission and the transferring of its functions to the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. And these are not all of the proposed changes that are there, but just to give you a sense of some of the underlying issues that are forming this critical conversation that we're having today. And while the government of Zimbabwe has tried to frame these proposals as measures to ensure continuity, stability, and administrative efficiency, there's been a lot of pushback from different places in Zimbabwe and outside as well that if enacted, these changes would significantly reduce citizen agency. It would weaken institutional checks and balances, but also consolidate executive power. And a lot of people have been warning that these changes could actually further constrict the civic space, which is already in a political system that is already shaped by longstanding concerns about democratic accountability. And so as we think about the Zimbabwean context, I think it's also very important for us to think about it within the context of other comparative experiences in the continent, in countries like Angola and Togo. We see how constitutional redesign can be used to insulate incumbents from electoral pressure. What is therefore at stake as we think about Zimbabwe is not just an issue of longer presidential terms, for instance, but the trajectory of Zimbabwe's democratic institutions, but also the protection of citizens' rights, particularly for us young Zimbabweans who are seeking responsive and accountable leadership. And so this conversation today brings together Zimbabweans from different parts of the country and the diaspora to examine the practical implications of this bill. We're trying to explore questions around why these changes matter, how citizens can meaningfully engage with them, and what it means to defend democratic principles at this pivotal moment. So with this context in mind, I will hand over to my co-host, Nick Chisman, to introduce our speakers, and then we'll start the conversation.
Thanks so much, Mentati, and it's great to be here today with a wonderful set of speakers. First of all, we're really pleased to be joined by Daniel Chikundu, a journalist specializing in Zimbabwe's legislative affairs with over 10 years of experience. As Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Parliamentary Journalist Forum and former editor of Open Parley ZW, he focuses on parliamentary transparency, ethics, and democratic accountability. We also have Samkeliso Chuma, a women's rights advocate and founder of the Girls' Table, amplifying the voices of young women in political and socio-economic processes. With a background in economics and finance and pursuing a master's in public policy, she analyzes how constitutional reforms affect women's representation and leadership. But that's not all, folks, because our third guest speaker today is David Coulthard, who will be known to many of you as the mayor of Bulawayo and a veteran human rights lawyer with over 4 decades of experience, a founding member of the MDC, a former Minister of Education, and of course a leading critic of some of the constitutional changes we'll discuss today. Last but never least, we are joined by Blessing Gojana, a seasoned human rights lawyer with 2 decades of experience advancing constitutionalism and the rule of law in Zimbabwe. A former leader with the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, she brings expertise in strategic litigation and democratic reform to her analysis of the proposed amendments. Before we go to our first speaker, however, we'd like to remind you that you will all get the opportunity to ask questions and contribute your own thoughts after the panel has given their submissions. You can also share your thoughts as a comment here or tweet and tag. So first of all, just to help us make sure that we get the message out, please do tweet about the space. You can do that from the space. Share it with your followers. That will enable us to get more people listening to these important issues. And in the coming days and weeks, please do share the link on your timeline so that we can expand the conversation. Great. So to kick us off, Daniel, I'd like to come to you first, if that's okay. Many of our listeners won't be as familiar about Zimbabwe and about these specific constitutional changes as you and some of our sort of Zimbabwean friends. So to kick us off and get us all on the same page, could you give us a sense of the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 3 and the context within which it's arising? In particular, what are the implications here of moving from direct presidential elections to legislative selection? Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So basically, I think Chanti has already highlighted some of the issues from this amendment bill. But I think what I can do is to give maybe a context of the situation, the time when this bill is coming into Zimbabwe. For those that do not know, this bill is coming at a time when our government passed what they call the PVO bill, which among other things actually prohibits civil society organizations from participating in what they deem as political activities. You find that these are advocates, the civic education that are related to politics. And I think this is going to work for them, especially with regards to this bill. It's going to be difficult actually for civil society organizations to actually do advocacy work, because I think they are likened to our political activities. It is also coming at a time when the NGO sector in Zimbabwe is at its weakest due to funding issues. For those people or organizations or countries that mostly support civic society organizations, most of them they are repurposing their funds, the NATO budgeting and other things in their home countries. So it is going to be difficult to mount meaningful resistance by civil society organizations in Zimbabwe. The bill is also coming at a time when demonstrations are banned by the police, although they are allowed by the Constitution, but you still need to apply for permission from the police. So it's going to be difficult for citizens who want to register their displeasure by demonstrating and also doing other various things. Bill is also coming at a time when there's widespread infighting in Zambia because of succession issues. You realize that what the resolution from the National People's Conference says and what the bill is saying, they are totally 2 different things. I think there are views from others that this bill might be inspired by attempts to create a dynasty, or probably the fearing that the choice of a successor might be weak and might not have the dexterity to contest a general election. Hence, they want to remove the direct election. The bill is also coming at a time when the opposition is at its weakest. Realize that the main opposition leader, Mr. Nelson Chamisa, had left the political sphere for some time because of infighting in his political party, and only came back a few weeks ago. Generally, what is there on the ground in terms of opposition is that there is no unit among the opposition leaders to mount meaningful resistance. And then also it is coming at a time when Parliament is tilted towards ZANU-PF in terms of numbers. For example, you realize that the National Assembly, for example, is 280 members, and the opposition is about 80 members. So it's going to be to mount in meaningful resistance in terms of this bill. So basically, this is the context within which this bill is coming. It's going to be difficult for the people of Zimbabwe to actually mount meaningful resistance. But this is not to say that resistance will not be there. It will be there, but it's going to be very difficult. I think for now, I'll rest my case here.
Thanks so much for that. And one of the things I think is most striking is that the constitutional amendments seem to take a leaf out of the book of Angola and Togo. In both of those countries, we've seen presidents who wanted to stay in power but were losing popularity essentially try and get away from the population and the ballot box by removing presidential elections as direct elections and having the presidents elected effectively by the largest party in the legislature. Now, of course, because of histories of gerrymandering and electoral manipulation, the party that's dominant in the legislature, as you've just said, is usually the ruling party. And so what you do is you take away a kind of semi-competitive presidential election. Let's not forget that despite all of the constraints, Nelson Chamisa won 40% plus in recent elections, demonstrating the limited popularity from Mnangagwa. You get away from that, and essentially you have a closed shop in which people vote for MPs, but they don't vote for the president, and then the MPs then vote for the president, but it's a foregone conclusion because we all know who's going to have a majority within parliament. So I think it's really important to convey to people how significant a shift this would be in Zimbabwe, but also that this isn't a new thing in Zimbabwe. This follows on from developments in Angola and Togo. And I think one of the things that we need to watch is this kind of going to become a new form of civilian coup, where instead of having the sort of military takeover of power we've seen in West Central Africa, we see supposedly civilian leaders effectively insulating themselves from power and making sure that they don't actually get held accountable at the ballot box as a result of essentially removing presidential elections from the political system. So that leads me to a question. You've spoken very eloquently about the challenges facing civil society, the challenges facing opposition. What is left then for citizens to do? What can those people who are listening to the call, who are alarmed by this, who want to do something, what space is open to them? And how is it possible to bring about challenges to these proposals, given the constrained environment that you were just describing?
Okay, thank you, Nick. So for the general citizens, generally, as they use that are currently there, they can still demonstrate, although they will get arrested. So you know how it is here. There is still also the court avenue. I think there is already a court challenge that was launched, I think, by, I've forgotten the name. I think it is being represented by Professor Lafmo Matuku. But out of that, also the parliamentary procedure still avails an opportunity for citizens to give their views or register their displeasure on the bill. You realize that right now, after the 90 days, the bill is going to be introduced in Parliament, and they need to go for public hearings. With Parliament, will then start to guard people's views. So those that have got issues or those that want to register their displeasure, they can take advantage of those public hearings. Parliament often advertise those. I think also some media organizations and even at Open Party, where I also work, we also advertising those and also doing some focus work just to highlight issues to focus on. But in terms of after the public hearings now, the citizens can still lobby their MPs, because after the public hearings, Parliament will compile a report that will be read in Parliament during second reading. And at that time, the MPs can also debate and highlight some of the displeasure from the citizens. And then from that now, after second reading, I think it will be now the MPs in the government in the committee stage, which is at the stage where these changes can take place. But even as we have seen with other bills that have been enacted in Zimbabwe, for example, the PVO bill, when it was still a bill, I think some NGOs actually engaged the president to try and highlight some of the shortcomings of the bill. And I still think those avenues are still there. Still, the president has always indicated that he is a listening president, and that the voice of the people is always the voice of God. But also coming back to the issue of public hearings, what we've also noted from the previous bills, especially Constitution Amendment Bill number 2 and the PVO bill, is that there has been a tendency by some people to disrupt the public hearings. It is said that Parliament has not done anything about that, but it's still an avenue that people can still use to give their views. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that. I think we'll come back a bit later to just find ways of reflecting on what people can also do. I know that there's other people that will join us a bit later in the conversation, and this question of what can people do, how do they get engaged, and also to reflect on some of the questions around the best way to get the information to the people, because in some of the conversations that I've been on about the constitutional amendment, the people have been a lot more concerned about the language that is being used to explain what the changes are and what they mean. And this big call for trying to simplify it and get it to a language that people understand, and in that way mobilize them. But thank you so much for those preliminary reflections. I think they give us a good sense of not just the changes themselves, but also the context that makes it very difficult for civil society and different players to mobilize. But without, as you said earlier, literally saying that there is no way of pushing back. I think there are ways that people can engage, and we will discuss that more towards the end of the conversation. Samuel, I wanted to bring you into the conversation because a lot of the work that you do is within the women and youth leadership space. What are some of the concerns that you have around the proposed changes, and also maybe building on some of Daniel's reflections earlier about this space being very complex right now for the kind of mobilization that you're potentially used to in the work that you're doing to get young women, young people involved. So maybe you can reflect a little bit on that for us.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Mantate. Thank you for the invitation. These conversations are truly important for us to have right now, because we're witnessing a restructuring of the governance framework in our country that consolidates a party-state model. I know we're always aware that there's a conflation between the state and ZANU-PF, but it is sad to see that the constitution is being used as a tool to further the interests of the ZANU elite. The conversation around women, youth, people with disabilities is missing even in the amendment. So this makes me reflect on where do we center the women, where do we center the youth and people with disabilities. So the government claims that these are constructive reforms meant to reinforce a constitutional governance and promoting political stability. And I think that's debatable, and we're allowed as Zimbabweans to debate that. Because every reform done by the ZANU-led government has always been about the elite, political survival, and absolutely nothing to do with the ordinary citizens. And when I talk about ordinary citizens, I'm talking about the women, I'm talking about the youth, I'm talking about the people with disabilities, people at the grassroots level. These are usually not at the a thought in the grand scheme of things. And I'm also concerned with the centralization of power through the extension of presidential and parliamentary terms in line with the ZANU-PF resolution and indirect election of the president by citizens. So the bill proposes that the president will be elected by parliament. And this is problematic because parliamentarians have served their own interests. And this is a sentiment shared by citizens when we're engaging with young women on the ground. And some of them don't even know who their parliamentarians are. Some of them have not even engaged with their parliamentarians since 2023. So whose interest are they going to serve? So what we've seen in Zimbabwe, we've seen that self-interest always overshadows public service. So when it comes to public service delivery, which affects women the most, gets overshadowed. People are thinking about cars. People are thinking about how they can personally benefit from being parliamentarians. So this is very problematic if citizens are not able to elect their own president and we're giving parliamentarians that power. What are we saying? What are the chances that they will represent the interests of the marginalized communities? And we've seen in Zimbabwe that ZANU uses its economic power to capture even individuals from what we call the progressive, the democratic people, the opposition, to do its bidding. We saw the recalls that were done by Douglas Mozora and then Tabangu in 2023. And I want to say this, and I'm not going to be apologetic about it. Tabangu used material grievances that were legitimate, that were genuine. Whether people want to agree, whether people want to gaslight, that's the reality. So we have individuals, we have characters that use genuine grievances from constituencies that have been marginalized, like Matabeleland, to push for their interests. So how can citizens trust such characters and parliamentarians to vote for a president who will represent their interests? As a material person, like when you're engaging with people in Matabeleland, the worry is, okay, we're already struggling with representation, political representation. We don't have the economic power and we are struggling with political clout. So who's going to represent us in terms of pushing the interests of our region and also the young people? And these amendments, they'll make us see that those with both economic power and political clout, they'll elect a person, as I've said before, a president who will represent their interests. So marginalized communities, women, youth, persons with disabilities, they will remain politically excluded. They don't have economic power. Or young people don't have the economic power. They are unemployed. Women and youth, they make up the majority of the informal sector. Abala mali mandate, they don't have the economic resources. So they cannot even influence the governance framework. They cannot even influence who gets to be in parliament. They have to depend on the big boys. That's what I call the big boys, people that have political clout to determine, are you going to be able to be part of, are you going to make it as a parliamentarian? It depends on those that have the power. But women and youth don't have the power. And we've seen in Zimbabwe where women are only used and the youth are used to just push the agendas of those that have both the economic power and political clout. So I just want to see young people being used and abused. We're going to see young people really thinking about migrating, leaving Zimbabwe, because another 5 years or another 2 years of being under ZANU-PF, where you are not even considered, where there's high unemployment, what are the chances of you even getting a job if you're not politically aligned? So we'll see a migration, and we'll see young people just not being interested. And some, they'll tweet for the ruling elite just to get breadcrumbs, just to get something to put food on the table. So that's what we're going to see in the next 2 to 5 years. If we're going to push these constitutional amendments, some will be disappointed. It's honestly disappointing to see such levels of centralization of power by the ZANU-PF government. And my other concern is the increase when it comes to the number of senators that are going to be appointed directly by the president. They say the increase will be 10, and that raises the size of senators to 90. And this is another way for ZANU to expand opportunities for political appointments. And this strengthens patronage networks. And we're already dealing with patronage networks. We're already dealing with people getting tenders because of their loyalty to the government, their loyalty to the president, their loyalty to, which is a problem. And if you're not aligned, if you're not, I don't want to use the word loyal, if you are in the opposition, what are the chances of you accessing tenders, accessing the economic pie? So we'll see the loyal being rewarded, being given these seats. And where do we place the young people? Because I believe the Constitution says that for you to be a senator, you have to be above 40. What about those that are below 40? What are we saying? Because already the youth quota has not done an incredible job in terms of increasing the number of youth participating in the governance framework. And also women, we can talk about the gender quota, but still it has not been enough when it comes to increasing the number of women. So why do we want to increase the number of senators when we still need to deal with the women and the youth that are not fairly represented in the political framework. And then the other concern for me is the repeal of the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, where the bill says they'll transfer the functions of the Gender Commission to the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. That's a great concern because we're still far, far behind when it comes to achieving gender parity. And already we want to remove the Gender Commission that has been doing great work in conducting initiatives towards gender equality. So to place it under Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission, it means that the issues and the initiatives and the programs that were meant to address the issues faced by women and girls, especially from rural communities, they're going to take a backbencher, to be honest. Also, I have a problem with this bill when it comes to the Gender Commission. And also, my other concern is the bill saying it will repeal the Peace and Reconciliation Commission. We have an issue where the genocide, we're still trying to address it. And right now it's placed under the purview of the chiefs, the traditional leaders, and that debate around that how can traditional leaders be involved and leading this process when we have a Peace and a Reconciliation Commission? So what does it mean? What does it mean for us to remove a commission that was meant to address these issues that we have in the country, that will not run away, that will not disappear as long as we don't address them? So these are my concerns, Mantate. I'm really worried about where we're going as a country, and I'm worried about how defeated the young people are going to be, knowing that their voices will continue being marginalized. They have to wait for the big boys to determine and to influence. It is painful. It's painful to really think about it and reflect on the voices of young people. We're just going to be carrying the buckets and whatever just to beg for breadcrumbs and other things just to survive. Back to you, Mantate.
Thank you so much. I think you've given us a very humane aspect of this bill, the implications for everyday people, and just some of the efforts that have been made over the years to try and get young people, to get women, to get people with disabilities in positions of influence. And you mentioned a lot of other things, but I think one of the things that I find very interesting in something you mentioned about traditional leaders being the appointed brokers on the issue of Kukuraundi. And also it's very interesting because in one of the proposals that is there, it's a proposal to allow them to express and exercise their political rights. So again, it brings into question the conversation about the contradictions there and the levels of influence that political expression could have on this mandate that I have, especially when you're removing the peace mission. But I think also something else that I wanted to comment on that you mentioned, the idea of the indirect election, especially when it comes to women, like you rightly mentioned, that the structures that we have been male-dominated for so long, and there's not been a prioritization of women in higher levels of influence. So thinking about taking it into parliament, that, as you rightfully mentioned, there's people that have expressed a lot of selfishness in the way that they engage or push forward some of the discussions in parliament, some of the policies in parliament. So there's a concern there around the kind of influence that this has on women's participation in political processes, as well as young people. And the other thing I wanted to ask you maybe briefly before we go on to David Coulthard is just the question around what can be done by the people in the kind of work that you're doing to get the information to the people. Because I think, like I said earlier, that there's been a lot of concern around when you go online on Twitter, the language is very technical. It's just legal jargon for a lot of people. So what can be done to get this language in a way that can get to the people, but also not just get to the people, but to ensure that the views and perspectives of the people come back within the context that Daniel mentioned earlier, that the space is a bit limited? Samu, if you can hear me, you can unmute and speak.
Okay. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. Thank you for that question, Mantate. The media has a critical role of educating and informing the masses. I think we need to go back there because they can access every house, every village. So the media has to really do that role of educating and informing the masses. But unfortunately, we are in a partisan context, and And the media, especially the traditional media, it has pushed propaganda. We've seen with Herald, Chronicle, where the message is around pushing the narratives that favor the ruling elite. So I don't know if we can really rely on the traditional media, because even when it comes to community radio stations, they are tight. They cannot speak in a way that will disfavor the ruling elite. So we have to rely on social media. Social media will do the hard work for us. So I've already seen people that are hosting spaces to debate the bill, which is good. But what I've noticed is that social media also amplifies the voices of the few, and it is not balanced. So we're being fed, the citizens are being fed narratives that don't really leave you with, okay, what am I learning? How can I make my decisions from an informed place? Because it's either A or B. There's no, I don't know if I should say neutrality, but we're not allowing people to make their own opinions. So we really need the civil society organizations to play the part, to really educate the masses, to really break down this bill into a language that is easy to understand, that is clear. Do social media campaigns, especially on WhatsApp. WhatsApp is a platform that most people can access, and it is affordable. Even us, the Girl Table, the team was doing a WhatsApp dialogue. I know Community Podium, these small emerging organizations that are doing these conversations to educate, to allow voices of the marginalized to be amplified. So we need to work with the grassroots organizations and get them to push and get them to educate the masses. And also the parliamentary, that's their job to inform their constituencies about the bill, what it means, and not from a place of A versus B. We want citizens to make their own choices. So they need to give the citizens the bill, explain it in a way that's understandable, but also make sure that the citizens are allowed to debate and engage from their own understanding. And please, and I want to beg the media, especially those that have influence on social media, to really be wary of becoming ZANU-PF, where one voice is only heard and others are not allowed to critique. Let's allow each and every voice to be expressed so that people can have, they can have a space where they can say, okay, I agree with A or B, but I don't, without us insulting each other. So I think the civil society organizations can do the hard work. Parliamentarians need to do the hard work, and also the media influencers, if I can call them, they need to do the hard work. But otherwise, I think right now as Zimbabweans, we're too binary. So it's hard for people to make informed decisions, because what the information that is being shared favors A or favors B, but that's not what we want. Right now, we want intelligent debates that will allow ordinary citizens to make their own choices. And then also with the public hearings, I know that the Parliament will do public hearings. We need them to be inclusive. There are areas that we need to reach. So the Parliament needs to make sure that the public hearings are inclusive and everyone is involved. We cannot delegate the future of this country to a few individuals, whether it's opposition, whether it's ZANU-PF. Everyone must be involved. So let's make sure that each and every person who has the bill understands, they break it and they share with everyone. I hope I made sense, Mantashe. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Great job. Thank you very much. Making very strong sense. David Coulthard, Mr. Mayor, if I could come to you now, picking up on some of the things that we've just heard. I think one of the things that's perhaps going to be confusing to some of our listeners and perhaps to people outside of Zimbabwe is that some of the individuals who seem to be forcing the changes are those that people on this call might historically have thought of as being opposition figures. So we have people in Parliament and outside of Parliament who historically we would have connected with MDC or with CCC, now seeming to endorse these proposals, which I think confuses the situation for those who are perhaps not as closely, intimately following Zimbabwean politics. Could you give us a sense of what is happening within the opposition and how that is complicating efforts to resist the constitutional changes? Thank you.
Well, thank you and good evening to everyone. I've been fascinated listening to the contributions. I think that there's good and bad news regarding the opposition. For those who don't know the situation within Zimbabwe, many of us are not surprised by the expressions of support coming from certain quarters of what ostensibly are opposition members. after the 2023 election, sleepers within the opposition, clearly working with ZANU-PF for, in some cases, decades, revealed their true colors and came out and effectively, with the support of political judgments and the support of ZANU-PF, in essence, took over the Triple C. And so they are the same elements now who are saying that they support these amendments, and knowing, I think, that they will be richly rewarded for that support. Aside from anything else, they will, at the very least, get 2 more years in Parliament or in Council without having to suffer the indignities of another election. And I have absolutely no doubt that there will be all sorts of inducements for those people. One of the things I've made very clear as an opposition mayor is that because of the illegalities of this amendment, and it's something that we haven't discussed this evening, in particular, ZANU's refusal to take aspects of these amendments to a referendum, I view them as illegal, particularly the clauses that extend the term of office of incumbents. And I've said very clearly that I will not go beyond my original term of August 2028, which is when my 5-year term extends to. But that's the negative regarding the opposition. There is another side to this. And for all the statements this evening, which are absolutely correct about the opposition being arguably the weakest the opposition has ever been since 1980, the fact of the matter is that this issue is now uniting the opposition. It's a rallying point for the opposition in a manner that we haven't seen probably since the last time there was a major constitutional debate in 2000. And we've seen a broad range of opposition leaders, civil society leaders and activists, senior lawyers, and many others uniting around the call that what they're doing is fundamentally illegal, but also uniting around the notion that what they're doing goes totally against the entire process which led to the 2013 election. As between 2009 and 2013, there was an elaborate and very expensive process which culminated in the referendum in March 2013, which approved with a 94% majority the current constitution. And that was a very carefully crafted constitution which sought to balance power amongst the 3 arms of government: judiciary, legislative, and executive. And these amendments literally drive horses and carriages through those fundamental provisions. If we just touch on briefly, for example, the change now in the appointment of judges, which totally undermines the independence of the judiciary. We've spoken this evening about the fact that traditional leaders can now become overtly partisan. The requirement that they not be partisan was part of that delicate balance engineered into the 2013 election. And then, of course, at the core of all of this is the extension to 2030. And potentially beyond that, the riding roughshod of Section 328 of the Constitution, which in particular deals with the fact that no constitutional amendments can benefit incumbents without a referendum. And ZANU-PF's determination to simply ignore the provisions of 328 has had the effect of uniting virtually the entirety of what I term the genuine opposition, and not charlatans, not people who are pretending to be opposition, but really are just pseudo opposition. And so my hope is that going forward, whilst I'm very sober about this process, because it's very clear that ZANU are absolutely determined to push this through come what may. But despite that, I think that you will see in the coming 90 days a concerted and well-coordinated opposition to these proposed amendments, which may not block them because of ZANU-PF's determination, but I think which will demonstrate a greater unity in the opposition than we've seen in years.
Thanks, David. It's always inspirational to hear you speak. And of course, what you're managing to do in such a constrained environment, I know is also a leading light for others. On that, maybe I could just come back to you with a couple of quick questions. One, do you see a kind of possibility of building out from the remaining strongholds of resistance, your position as Mayor Bulawayo, etc., in terms of sustaining opposition and being able to build that back at some point to a national level movement? And second, I wonder what you would say to the people on the call who might be from donors who are engaged in Zimbabwe or multinational businesses who are engaged in Zimbabwe, many of whom I think are very concerned about what's happening, but don't really, I think, have a lot of tools at their disposal and perhaps feeling a little bit out of ideas about how to engage with ZANU-PF in a productive way at this point. And are, of course, also very aware that their involvement can lead to the demonization of the opposition. What would you say to them about the correct or most effective role that they could play right at this moment in time? Because presumably, if we're going to see the amendments not enforced, it's going to be a combination of the kind of sustained engagement and resistance that people have talked about, plus some pressure behind the scenes from those people who still can exert it. What do you think would be the most effective way for that to happen moving forwards?
Okay, dealing with the first part of your question, whether this will enable the opposition to become more cohesive. To be frank, I'm very negative about the opposition at present. I've made those feelings very clear because of our preoccupation with personality over policies. And I fear that until the opposition start to coalesce around policies, and in particular democratic constitutions to govern the operations of political parties, we're going to continue to flounder and remain divided after this constitutional amendment process has ended. And that's an entirely different debate that all of us in this conversation today need to have. We need to learn the lessons, I hope, that will be taught to all of us over the next 3 months regarding the importance to rally around issues rather than personalities. Let me end this segment of your question on a rather pessimistic note. We need to understand the intention behind these amendments. They are so broad and so destructive of that balance I spoke about earlier, that they're clearly designed to ensure that there won't ever be even a semblance of a free and fair election going forward. If we look at the provisions that seek, in essence, to dismantle the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission and give, for example, the preparation of the voters' roll back to the Registrar General, who's appointed directly by the President, we can see an intention to manipulate the electoral process even further. If we look at their total disregard, once again, of 328 and this extension, if they achieve this 2-year extension, and if the Constitutional Court rubber stamps that, there is nothing to stop them simply extending it even further. I think that a lot of the motivation, to come back to your earlier point, Nick, is not so much the countries that you mentioned, but what they've seen in Tanzania and Uganda in the last 6 to 8 months. They've realized that for all the state apparatus that the Museveni, for example, has in Uganda, all the control that he has, he was still unable to prevent this overwhelming demonstration of support for Bobi Wine. And of course, the same in Tanzania, where they had to go to extreme lengths to ensure that people like Tundu Lissu were not allowed even to campaign. And so that is their worry. They are desperately worried about the prospect of an election in 28, and they will do all in their power to ensure that they can avoid an election in 2028, and even if there's an election in 2030, that they have sufficient time to totally dismantle and undermine existing institutions, bad as they have been in the run up to those elections. So that's a very negative comment, but it is a reality that we face as opposition in this country. We need to see that the real intention behind this is really to create a de facto a one-party state, which does not have to subject itself to anything remotely resembling a free and fair election. Turning to your second point regarding people, perhaps donor organizations and others, I think that they have a critical role to play in the next 90 days. It's clear that ZANU aren't going to have a referendum. Obviously, that's subject to the Constitutional Court. I hope that the Constitutional Court acts professionally and interprets Section 328 as it has interpreted it before in the case of Marx Mopungu, the 2021 case against the Minister of Justice, where they said 328 applies and that a referendum is needed. They're going to have to try and find their way around that. But once again, I'm very concerned about the confidence that ZANU-PF has demonstrated in promulgating these proposed amendments, and it must be that they are confident that they're going to get the right judgment out of the Constitutional Court. But the point I'm simply making is that whilst it is clear that a referendum is necessary, it is equally clear that ZANU-PF is determined to use whatever means at their disposal to ensure that this is not put to a referendum, because they know that they will lose, which makes the consultative process over the next 90 days critical. We've seen that ZANU are already trying to stifle dissent. The state-controlled media hasn't allowed any expressions of dissent at all against the amendments. The entire thrust of the state-controlled media is that this is open and shut, that they just simply need a 2/3 majority, that it's in the best interest of the country. That we've seen how they've started intimidating and even detaining people. And just this evening, I've been advised of an event that I was due to speak at in Bulawayo tomorrow concerning these amendments, which has now suddenly been cancelled at the last minute. I'm not sure of the reasons. I have my own suspicions, but I think that you're going to see in the next 90 days extreme measures being taken by ZANU-PF to stifle the opportunity that people have, which is a constitutional right, to express their opposition to these measures. And it's in that environment that the international community, donors, I think, have a unique opportunity in the next 3 months to assist Zimbabweans express their views as freely as possible. Just one closing remark. I'm grateful that, for example, the EU was so quick to correct a statement made in the Herald newspaper, that the Herald published an article which in essence said that the EU ambassador thought that the constitutional amendments were all in order. And they have had to, and to their credit, they've made a statement saying that this was a misrepresentation of what the ambassador said. But it's little measures like that that the international community is going to have to be very firm on to make it clear that the constitution, the existing constitution of Zimbabwe, and in particular, I come back to the section 328. 328 must be respected. The wording of 328 is absolutely clear. A referendum should be held, and it doesn't matter how anyone seeks to interpret it in some other way, or even the Constitutional Court perhaps interprets it in another way. The wording of 328 is so clear, and I trust that the international community will make that point.
Thank you so much for all of those different points that you've raised. And I think one of them that I would like to just depart from as we move to the next speaker is just the idea of the long-term impact of these changes if they're enacted. And they're very consistent with, for instance, what young people have been framing as this being a threat to their future, because the primary drivers and beneficiaries of this constitutional redesign and power consolidation do not have that bigger commitment to young people. They are looking at themselves. And so there's this big question about what does this mean for us, not just right now, but thinking about the future as well, but also just based off the kind of legal angles that you've been trying to push us to think about and to have in mind as we think about what can be done. And also in the way that we analyze what people are doing, what we're seeing is just the need for different sectors to play their role. And people who have the legal appreciation of the bill and those who understand constitutionalism from this legal standpoint to push from that angle. But also those in media, like Samuel mentioned, Daniel works within that space to think about taking that information to the people and ensuring that the perspectives of the people also come back. Civil society and also us as young people, different platforms, the creative platforms that are there, because there's this big question has been about what is the role of young people? What is Gen Z in Zimbabwe thinking about this as well? So thank you so much for that. Blessing, I'll bring you into this conversation because as we mentioned earlier, there are a number of changes that are being lined up that appear to impact on the transparency of the judiciary and the potential to hold perpetrators accountable for human rights violations, such as the elimination of the public interviews in the judicial appointment process. How are you viewing these proposals? What explains them? What are your thoughts around that?
Thank you, Atif, and your team at Resistance Bureau. Before I answer your question, let me start by making this remark that through the Constitutional Amendment Bill number 26, Zimbabwe is not just amending a constitution. We are being asked to quietly surrender our power. And we must ask who is benefiting from these amendments. I'm glad that the previous speakers have eloquently elaborated on the nuances behind these amendments. Zimbabwe stands at a constitutional crossroads, as you have already alluded to. In 2013, over 94% majority voted for a new constitution. It was not perfect, we understand, but it was ours. It was born out of public participation. It was a social contract between the people of Zimbabwe and the state. Now, through the Amendment number 3 bill, that contract is being fundamentally rewritten. And not by referendum, not by the people of Zimbabwe, because the people of Zimbabwe have not asked for these amendments, but through parliament, just a select group of elite. This is not a small technical adjustment. These are structural changes to how power works in Zimbabwe. Now, coming back to your question, Matante, let me start here. When you weaken transparency in judicial appointments, you weaken public confidence in justice. The proposal to remove public interviews in the appointment of judges is not a small procedural tweak. Public interviews were introduced precisely to increase transparency, credibility, and merit-based selection in the judiciary. They allowed Zimbabweans to see who is being appointed, what their judicial philosophy is, how they understand constitutional rights, and whether they demonstrate independence. Public interviews are not theater. They are a constitutional safeguard. Removing them concentrates discretion back into the executive hands. While consultation with the Judicial Service Commission may remain, the public-facing accountability mechanism disappears under these proposed amendments. And this matters deeply in a context like Zimbabwe's, where courts frequently adjudicate politically sensitive cases such as electoral disputes, constitutional challenges, cases involving security forces, and human rights violations. If the appointment process becomes less transparent, the perception and potentially the reality of executive influence increases. Now, let us connect this to accountability. Accountability for human rights violations depends on 3 pillars. We all know that. The independence of judiciary, an independent prosecutorial authority, and public in both the judiciary and the prosecution. The bill also proposes to remove the requirement that the Prosecutor General be appointed on advice of the Judicial Service Commission. That further consolidates power in the executive. When the same branch of government that may be implicated in rights violations gains greater influence over both judicial and prosecutorial appointments, accountability mechanisms weaken. Even if no abuse occurs, the perception of reduced independence damages legitimacy. So you ask me what explains these proposals. Of course, we have been told that the proposals seek to improve efficiency through streamlining processes, reducing delays, and avoiding politicization of interviews. And we all know that's a lie. The true and critical explanation is power consolidation, in my view. Public interviews expose candidates to scrutiny. They create a record. They allow civil society and the media and the general public to evaluate suitability of candidates. Removing them reduces visibility and lowers the political cost of controversial appointments, which we have been witnessing pre-2013 election. 2013, the constitutional amendment in 2013. In constitutional democracies, transparency is not a luxury. It is a defense mechanism. And when transparency is rolled back, especially in the judiciary, alarm bells should ring. So in this case, there must be firm opposition to these amendments as they seek to dismantle the remaining safeguards that ensure an independent judiciary in Zimbabwe following the first and second amendments. I'll end here and reflect further in the subsequent conversations. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you so much for the submissions. And what we're going to do now is open it up to the audience. There will be questions that come from them that we'll bring back to you. But for the audience, if you have a question, if you have a reflection, please send us a request for the mic and then we will give it to you. I think for the first round, we'll just take 3 people. And just so that we have a lot more people feeding into the conversation, we ask you to be very brief in your submission. So you can ask a question to a specific person in the panel, or you can just give us your own reflection that adds into the conversation. So I'll hand it over to Nick in the meantime to facilitate this section of the Q&A.
Thanks, Mantetta. Yeah, it's been a great discussion so far. So fantastic to be able to bring in some of our audience. We're going to come to Owen, Nika, and Jacqueline. So that's Owen, Nika, and Jacqueline. Please, we're going to go in that order. So Owen first. As Mantetta just said, please do keep it short because it enables us to bring in a lot more people and to take your points back to the panel so they can answer them. Owen, coming to you, and please do be brief.
So I think Owen might be having a mic situation. Owen, if you can hear us, you can just send a request for the mic. But Nika is on the mic. So Nika, maybe you can jump in.
Hearing 2 people speaking at the same time.
Okay, Owen, it looks like you can hear us, so please go for it. You have the mic, Owen, so please go for it.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, so you need to make your point now. Okay, Nika, I think you've got the speaker. If you can hear me, please unmute yourself and give us your contribution. Okay, anybody else who wants to ask a question, please do request. Nika, can you hear me?
Sorry, now I can hear you now. Yeah,
Please
right.
go for it. You're on the mic.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel for your contribution so far. I just wanted to point out that with our topic here says Zimbabwe at a constitutional crossroads. I do hope this is covering for the amount of time that we've been under a constitutional crisis. If we are assuming that our constitutional crisis started with the proposition by ZANU-PF to amend the constitution in recent months, this is not where we started. We have been forever in a constitutional crisis, including times when ZANU-PF didn't seek to change the constitution, but did things which looked like they were ignoring the constitution, abusing the constitution in order to batter the opposition. For all these years, they've been in existence since 1980. Now, our worst situation, which led to where we are today, was 2017, when ZANU-PF mutilated the constitution, used the army to stage a coup against the opposition, which for ZANU-PF was becoming a forever problem and formidable. It was going to be unbeatable because ZANU-PF was more and more getting unelectable. They did stage a coup, and this is where everything went wrong. And as Zimbabweans, and I think as we go forward, one thing we need to be able to cultivate into our selves, into our culture of doing things, is never to tolerate things and leave things to another day. I think that should have been fought, and should have become ungovernable from that point, and until things were addressed. But that didn't happen. I think we all saw what happened, and people in some quarters celebrated the coup, and the coup was debated in many circles as not having happened and all that, which was absolute nonsense. The coup had happened, and we are in that situation at the moment where we are living under a coup. But we tend to forget that when we discuss everything in Zimbabwe, we tend to forget that we are under a coup. So whenever ZANU-PF behaves the way it behaves now, we should take into context that they have a coup that they depended on in 2017. And the military hasn't withdrawn from that situation where they did stage a coup. The military did assist the current government come into power. And whatever election we did after that, which doesn't make any sense. But when you do elections after a coup, you know very well what's going to happen. Nothing is going to be in level in terms of the playing field. And I'm glad that we do have people like Mayor Coulter here, who have been in the trenches for many years and who know what I'm talking about. That for as long as we have a situation that we're living under, where we are under a de jure coup, then Zimbabwe is not going to make sense. ZANU-PF is going to behave like in a China shop, like they are doing, and they'll always bulldoze their decisions. So we've waited too long to be able to address our own problems as Zimbabweans with regards to ZANU-PF, and I don't think we are going to go very far in terms of stopping this. I'm sorry I didn't have a question. I just wanted to let this out.
That's
so that
fine.
we can
Thanks, Nico.
provide a bit of context.
Thanks so much. You made your point very
Thank you.
eloquently, so you got it out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to Dobbs right now. So
Always.
Dobbs, the mic is with you. Owen, I'll come to you in 1 second.
My question goes to those ones who are in the legal fraternity. They are telling us about the court challenge, and we don't know when is it going to happen. We know the results can go either way, but we can't prepare anything after that because we don't even know when is it going to happen. That one, they are just blanks. So we don't know when there's something which is going to happen, or we are going to have Monzora thing where he challenged the delimitation exercise, and then the court end up not hearing it. So we don't know where we are. So we can't prepare. If they can clarify on that issue of the Constitutional Court by the war veterans, we can understand better and prepare better. Thanks a lot, everybody. I reset.
Thanks so much, Dobbs. That's a great question. So we'll put that to the speakers in a minute. I also see Freelance. I think you've just been given the mic. So if you can hear me, please unmute yourself and you have the mic. Dobbs, please mute yourself again, and Freelance coming to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you well. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I only want to ask Mr. Coulter if he can answer this about this amendment. Does it not violate the Constitution, the processes to the people? And where does this Constitution text? Because when you're talking about this Constitution, I thought they were talking about a 3/3 or third of whatever. Did they get that third of that they were talking about to pass this? Has it been passed? Or it's just they are still trying to force this Constitution? Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, it is not passed yet. So that's one of the things that we're talking about, are the ways to resist it. It is not official yet. So thank you for that question. Important to clarify. Okay, I'm seeing Owen there. Owen, if you have the mic, please do unmute yourself and come on to speak. If not, I'm going to throw in one question for our speakers, which is a question about the most effective way are mobilizing in this very constrained environment. Of course, we know historically people in Zimbabwe have been very effective at mobilizing online, but we also know that kind of online campaigns can have limited effect on real life governments. So one of the things that would be interesting to talk about today is perhaps, are there any kind of forms of protest that are feasible within Zimbabwe? Are we saying after all of the excellent interventions, it is actually physically impossible to protest in Zimbabwe? And in that sense, are we actually talking about the emergence in Zimbabwe of a kind of police state on a scale that we actually don't see that often in sub-Saharan Africa? If we think about the region, it is possible to go and protest in Malawi or in Zambia, often with significant repression. Same in Kenya. But are we actually now saying that Zimbabwe is almost on a different plane in terms of the level of state control of repression? I think it would be interesting for some of the listeners to hear us reflect on that. Owen, I see you've got the mic, so let's try again. Please unmute yourself and you have the mic.
Thank you so much. Everybody can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
You please go for it.
All right, thank you so much. I just want to give hope to Zimbabweans and the citizens. I think Zimbabweans will give politicians too much power, of which they don't have this power that they are pretending to be having. The people who have power with this butchering of the constitution is Zimbabweans and citizens. I just joined in when people were saying we are left with just not much to do. But I still believe that if we come together as Zimbabweans, we've got a lot of things to do. We can employ non-violent resistance, of which it is over 197 methods that we can use as Zimbabweans. 5 methods that cannot warrant or that cannot provoke us being beaten, although we are going to be put in jail. But as resistance champions, we need not to be cowards. We need to be strong. If we not do anything as Zimbabweans, then we are doomed. This culture of waiting for politicians to become our messiah. I heard a lot of people talking about opposition. That is not opposition. I heard of people referring to opposition, which is not opposition. Because as far as I know, opposition is everyone who is opposed to what ZANU-PF is doing. But when we talk of opposition parties now, there we have a problem. We now have a problem of giving politicians too much power, and we sit back on our back seat. We give them the bus to drive us. I just want to say, Zimbabweans, let's come together as one and resist this. We've got so much that we can do. And it's not yet late. I know people are having community radios, there's resistance radio that is already there in place. Forget about ZBC, forget about Herald, forget about Chronicles, forget about anything that is controlled by ZANU-PF. Let's come with our own initiatives, our own community radios, and just hit the ball and attack ZANU-PF. We don't have time, guys. We have no time to be sassy. We have no time to think someone is going to bring this freedom to us. But Zimbabwe, thank you so much.
Thanks very much for that. I think it's an important challenge and a good message. Okay, I'm going to come to two more people. I'm going to come to Rest, and then I'm going to come to Alex Noyes. So I'm going to come to you two, and then I'm going to ask the panel to come back with their own kind of responses and their final word. So Rest, R-E-S-C, you have the mic. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got only a single question. The question is ZANU-PF not using the other two arms of the state to legitimize this thing that is unconstitutional? And now the question which I want to ask is, let's say if the other group decides to go to the court, the answer is obvious. They are going to lose. What's next after that? That is, if they go to the court. And finally, let me comment on the issue of the parliament. The moment we accept to go for 90 days, that particular debate process, we are legitimizing something that is unconstitutional. So my idea is that the only way, like what the previous speaker said, is for people to reject the 90 days. And they should sign it hard to make sure that they convene meeting within those 90 days of the parliament. Because if you allow them to convene, then it means you are legitimizing something, because they know that after 90 days, they will say that people were given chance. And what also, they went there and we managed to win. So this thing is now legal. So the question now is, are we not legitimizing this unconstitutional thing through the parliament and through the court? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Much appreciated. Alex Noyes. Alex, it's nice to see you again. Coming to you. Oh, you just seem to have disappeared from my screen. Alex, are you there? If not, perhaps we take this opportunity to start going back to our panel. So in doing so, I think it makes sense for us to go in the order of the panel. So maybe Daniel, I could come to you first and we can take your comment. And then if we manage to get Alex back, I'll let Alex speak. But let's go through the panel. So over to you, Daniel.
Okay, thank you, Nick. I think my comment will be the onus is on the citizens and the civil society organizations to start the process of gathering views or educating each other about the bill or its implications, putting it in language that can be understood by each and everyone from the village to whatever level. Because I know that when Parliament starts to do these public hearings, they are not going to go to every area. Usually they only target one city per province. And so it's going to be costly for other people then want to travel to that city. So I think civic society organization should use, I know that some of the civic organizations, they could award structures or grassroots structures. I think they can start with those to cascade information on what this bill means to the people. Because generally, what ZANU-PF is going to do is that they are only going to tell people that we want to increase the term of the president so that he can continue his good work or project that he is doing. So it is upon us, the media, the civil society organization, to go and tell the real truth to the people and highlight the real intentions or the ugliness of this bill. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Daniel. Alex, I see we've got you back. Nice to see you again. Do you want to come in and make your contribution now? And then we'll go back to the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Really appreciate it. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you come through loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nick and team. This has been really helpful. I have two quick questions. I think other panelists or questioners have already asked about the prospect of the court case. I'm so curious to hear if folks think the Constitutional Court will rule on this, and if so, when? And then second, I'm wondering if anybody can speak to the role of the military here. My understanding is that there are still some splits between Nga and Mnangagwa, and would love to hear if folks have any further thoughts on the role they might play over the next 90 days and more. Thanks, Nick. Cheers.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that's a great point. Well done, because we should really have raised this. Because, of course, for those of us who do try and follow Zimbabwe, one of the things that we've been wondering about for a long time is whether this attempted power grab by the president will exacerbate tensions within the ruling party and the military. And we know there's a lot of people, both in the military and ruling party, that do not want Mnangagwa to be a president for life. And so there's lots of speculation here about, is a second coup likely? Is Mnangagwa desperately trying to coup-proof the regime? And I think there's some evidence of that. So really good for you to remind us of some of the unintended consequences of this constitutional amendment, which may yet be actually the thing that leads to the downfall of ZANU-PF. Excellent. Which of our presenters would like to go to that? Blessing, would you like to go to that? David, would you like to come in there? Who would like to speak to those points? Well, Blessing, perhaps we could come to you next.
All
But
right.
don't feel you have to speak to those points. Feel free to speak to
Yes.
any of the points, and other presenters can also pick up on the questions Alex was raising. So feel free to come in on anything we've covered in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I lost the better part of your last question. I think my connection was acting up, but I've captured some of the comments or questions that have been raised by the listeners in the meeting. So in terms of the most effective way of mobilizing, I think Daniel has alluded to the fact that there is need for information dissemination. I just wanted to add that I think most of the conversations that have been happening have been around the procedural issues. The issue about referendums and the interpretation of the Constitution, the legality of the amendments, which is very critical. But I think more has to be done in terms of unpacking the substantive components of the bill. This bill is proposing a wide range of changes that impact on a number of issues, including human rights and freedoms, fundamental human rights and freedoms of the people of Zimbabwe. So I think what is needed is a concerted effort in terms of putting it in a simplified format for the citizens of Zimbabwe to understand what it means when a gender commission is being abolished and having its functions moved to a human rights commission, which is already inundated with cases of human rights in a country where we have high levels of gender-based violence, in a country where economic marginalization of women is high, in a country where there is political underrepresentation of women and unequal access to resources. What does that mean? I think there is need for the concerted effort to make sure that the substantive components of this bill are actually explained and put out there in a simplified format that people will understand. And in terms of the constitutional challenges, I think we have not heard much in terms of the media publicity around it. And I understand so far there is only one constitutional challenge that has been filed, and it is seeking to look at a number of issues, including whether the president, by authorizing cabinet to approve the bill, this was filed before the bill was enacted, I understand, was gazetted, but by authorizing the cabinet to approve the amendments, the proposed amendment, acted in a constitutional manner or acted in a way that violates his responsibility to uphold and respect the Constitution. But I would like to understand that a number of legal issues arise, both in the substantive nature of the amendments itself and most importantly on the procedural aspect. I think Mayor Coulthard has already alluded to the issue on interpretation of amendment, the section that allows for amendments to the Constitution, Section 328, and the need for a referendum if that section is going to be amended. I think it's a very critical issue, which the Constitutional Court has already ruled on in the case of Max Mapungo versus the Attorney General. So I cannot answer when this is going to be finalized. There are the rules of the Constitutional Court, of course, but there are also other considerations to consider when a case has been filed before the Constitutional Court. So I cannot give a definitive answer on that. But it's something that we must maybe watch and monitor. And I'm also anticipating that a number of constitutional challenges will also be filed depending on the nature of the issues or constitutional issues that are going to arise. In terms of the other avenues, protests and Zimbabwe being a police state, I agree with you. We have actually seen an increased effort by the state to close the democratic space through enactment of repressive legislation. Yes, Daniel has alluded to the PVO Act that is actually hanging over the shoulders of civil society organizations in Zimbabwe. None of the civil society organizations have been registered so far. Most of them have applied, but the registration application process has been suspended. So we don't know what's going to happen, whether it's timing and coincidental to these amendments that we already know. That is the strategy, that is the nature. But we also have the Patriotic Act, which criminalizes people who speak against the state. And by challenging government, we have seen that this has been interpreted or viewed to be unpatriotic and therefore criminalized. Any form of dissent is criminalized. So it will be very difficult even to then think of protests that have always been challenging even before the era of the Patriotic Act and the PVO Act. So it's a very closed space, but there are also avenues that my colleagues have alluded to that can still be utilized, although they are exclusionary in nature if they are going to be exclusive online. But I think we just have to make do with what is available, and with the hope that the international community will also come in to help amplify the voices in the various spaces we are operating in. That's all I can say for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your responses and your reflections. Samuel, I'm going to come to you. If there's anyone in the audience that feels they can respond to a particular question, please feel free to send us a request. I think we'll be able to take one or two people just to respond to the specific questions that were asked. But Samuel, over to you for your responses to the questions or just your closing reflection.
Okay, thank you, Mantate. I think I'll just give my closing reflection. It's hard when it comes to Zimbabwe and telling people what we should do. I think I've also gotten to a point of losing hope, because if we go the legal route, we know that the courts are captured, the judiciary is captured. And we know that when we talk about protests, how many people are willing to get arrested or to even lose their lives. I think as Zimbabweans, we've gotten to the point like, if I put myself on the line, what will happen to my family? Because there's no support structure that is available to ensure that people are protected when they protest. So I'm really not sure. What I know is that the Bible says that hope deferred makes the heart sick. And I know so many people in Zimbabwe, they're now sick when it comes to dealing with Zimbabwe. They are hopeless, and it's understandable because all the avenues are getting closed. Like most of us who work in rural communities, we're using the traditional leaders to do our activities. But now if traditional leaders are expected to toe the line and indicating where they stand, is going to be a challenge. So I'm not sure, Mantate, if I really know the answer. But what I can ask for Zimbabweans is that we need to decentralize efforts. What I've noticed that it's always Harare leading, and I have a problem with that. It's always Harare leading. They get to determine the voices and the programs that they say are legit. And that discourages people from even engaging or even leading initiatives to resist the 2030 or the constitutional amendment bill. So if you allow different groups, different individuals to come up with different efforts and initiatives, I think it will be helpful, and we support each other. We don't have to like each other. We don't have to love each other, but we know the agenda. We know that we want to have a Zimbabwe that works for all. So let's support people, whether we agree or not. It doesn't matter. Because already right now, most of us from Activaland, I can say that we are defeated, and we're worried if we have a voice and influence in the political discourse, because we saw the abuse and the insults that someone that we look up to torn apart because of their court application. And no one has actually said, okay, as the journalists want to investigate, we've been hearing one side of the narrative. What is true? Did Fuzoy get paid? What's going on? And no one has done that. We've only heard one narrative. And when people like me, Tandegil and others now say, no, but we've worked with Fuzoy, he's a person of integrity, we get insulted and attacked. And that discourages us even to lead an initiative. And we're like, you know what, might as well just keep quiet and let others do. But that kills the spirit, that kills solidarity, that kills this idea of us being a nation. It's only one part of the country that is allowed to lead movements, to lead resistance. So I think we really need to decentralize and allow people who can, instead of pointing fingers at people and calling them sellouts and whatever, that is discouraging. So I think as Zimbabweans, if we're going to really win at this, we need to decentralize, we need to encourage people, we need to support people, and stop using the ZANU way of doing things, where we say, if you're not in my group, then you are a sellout and you can't lead a resistance, you can't lead protests. That's problematic for me. So let's allow people to do what they can, because we never know whose movement is going to really make a difference or make a change. And especially now, someone will relate with Samgay because she's from Matebeleland, and someone will relate with someone else because they're from Manika land. But if you're going to kill the voices from those areas, you're actually killing the grassroots, because they're looking at those people to encourage them to stand up against this regime that's really frustrating everyone. So for me, Mantate, I'm not sure the best way forward, but decentralizing initiatives and allowing all the voices from all corners of Zimbabwe to do what they think is best when it comes to resisting the constitutional amendment and the ET 2030 agenda. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Samu, for your reflections. And I think one of the things I love that even as you express this diminishing hope that people have in the power that they have to push back, and that pushback actually resulting in something, is that you're also highlighting some of the key things that people should be thinking about doing in order to mobilize together, to collaborate. Because I think what it does is it sits it right next to the hope that you feel is being lost. Because I think the environment has been created, like Daniel said when we started, that makes people lose hope in what they can do. But the reason why we're here as a country engaging on this is because there's a recognition of the power of the people, and these amendments are meant to take away part of that power. And the reason why we need to keep that hope alive and continue to converse around the ways that we need to engage with this process, the way that we need to push back on this process, is actually building around this idea of the powers with the people and should stay with the people. So I will allow you, Chipo, to come in because I know you wanted to respond to a couple of the questions that were asked. So if you can hear me, please unmute and give us your reflection. Chipo, if you can hear me, you can unmute and give your reflections.
Hi, did you say Chipo?
Yes.
Okay, hi everyone. Sorry I'm a little late. One of the things I wanted to bring up, which somebody else also brought up, is the importance of the Gender Commission. I think that over the years, we've lost a lot of ground in civil society, and the onus is on our generation. I think people in our 30s and 40s and 50s, we have to start doing gender work, if you will. At another presentation, I noted that the percentage of children who were forced into child marriages went up almost 400% since COVID. That's a huge number, right? And our biggest challenge right now is that many of the people in power have these religious tendencies, I think, that would make it difficult for them to approach particular sects that encourage child marriages. But that's a big thing, right? So that's something to think about on why we can't have the Gender Commission dismantled. So child marriages being one. Something else that our generation of women in particular need to think about is the right of women to own property. Our ability to own our own properties is protected by the Constitution, right? And this is something that didn't exist in the 90s. So many people will remember dramas like Neria, where people lost their properties after their spouses died, things like that. Many of these cultural habits still exist, but when you have laws that protect women, you can push back against that. And then on the Constitution, a big challenge that we have right now on presidential term limits is that there are no people in ZANU-PF who think progressively. So I was looking back to the early 1980s when Robert Mugabe was proposing a one-party state. So one thing to keep in mind is that these things that leaders do are not new. They are never new, right? So it's happened in different parts of the continent, different parts of the world. But even in Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe wanted a one-party state. And much of the opposition to that came from within ZANU-PF. The problem right now is this rank-seeking patronage-based party. So without a strong opposition, and I hope I don't get into trouble with this, but we don't have a strong opposition, right? Nelson Chamisa was on sabbatical for a long time, which means that we lost a lot of organizational ground. And the other opposition leaders, if we can call them that, are already endorsing this. So people keep talking about the role of young people and educating them. But I think the onus is on our generation, the millennials in Zimbabwe, to take on the fight. So I always think back to how old was Tendai Biti when he began this work? How old was Mama Kupe when she began this work? We have to actively move into these spaces, do the educating. There's no one out there who is going to educate the young people or voters but us, the people on these panels, the people that come to these spaces. It's our job, our responsibility to do the advocating that we're calling for. because there are no other organized spaces that can do this. In a different world, we would have had the MDCs of this world, but that's just not the world that we exist in. So I'm really glad that we have this space, but we need to have more of them, right? And we need to show that we are committed. And I think in particular, the diaspora, we have an opportunity to use our voices, our resources to spread the word about what's happening, but to also outline for people what these changes mean for them directly. So I think that's what's always missing with these things sometimes, is that the average person doesn't know what it means for them. So I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you so much for including me.
Thank you so much for your submission. I think it's a great way to end. And I think something that I mentioned earlier, that what this conversation is pointing us to is the idea that everybody needs to be on the table doing what they need to do, whether it's in their sector, based on the skills they have, the knowledge that they have, the networks they have. What's important is that you show up and do something, not just Zimbabweans, but also Zimbabweans outside the country and also non-Zimbabweans that can do something. And I know that we would have loved to keep the conversation going, but time does not permit us. So please continue to have this debate, to show up for other conversations on the spiel, and to play your part in different ways. And a special thank you to our panel today for this very insightful conversation. Our team at the Resistance Bureau always looks forward to keeping in touch with the work that you do, but also the work that you're going to be pushing specifically around this issue. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And thank you to everyone else who's been with us today from the beginning when you joined us on the way. There's a recording that you'll be able to access after this. So if you missed any part of it, you should be able to catch up. But thank you so much for coming in, for sharing your thoughts through the comments and the questions that you asked, but also people that have been posting and taking us. Please continue to share those resources that you're sharing with us, with the people in the comment section. Continue the conversations. Take us as well if you want us to repost anything that you are going to be sharing, whether it's relating to the space or something else around this particular topic. And also just thank you for continuing to engage with our conversations. Like I mentioned earlier, that we are on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we are on Instagram, we're on different platforms. So just follow us wherever you're the most active, because we do have these conversations that focus on different African countries, but also global issues that have an impact on Africa. So follow us on our different platforms so that you don't miss notifications. You can also just follow us on our website. We have a website. It's just www.theresistancebureau.com. If you subscribe on our homepage, you will get updates on the show via email, but you can also then access some show summaries there and some of the participants' videos that we do at different times of the month. But also the final note, the continued success of this work and the platform that we have is reflective of the efforts for our entire team. Thanks to our tech manager, Peter Doré, and also our co-producer and co-host, Jeffrey Smith, who've been working behind the scenes to make sure that today's conversation is a success. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Remember to share this Twitter space in your timelines. We really appreciate your presence here and all the work that you're doing. Stay safe in the meantime. Keep fighting the good fight, and see you next time.